Hi, sixth graders. I'm going to go ahead and read the chapter with you today. We are on chapter 8, From Monarchy to Republic. The big question here in this chapter is what happened to the royal family. And after reading the Scarlet Pimpernel, you should have a pretty good idea of what happened to the king and queen in France. Escape. Shortly after midnight on June 21st, 1791, a plump man in dark clothes passed through the palace gates of the Tuileries. The guard paid little attention. He had seen a duke leave at the same time every night. But this night it was different. This night the man in dark clothes was actually the King of France in disguise. Once through the gate, the king entered a waiting carriage. Inside were 2 women and 2 children, the king's sister, his 2 children, his daughter, and his son dressed as a little girl, and the children's governess. In the dim light, another woman approached the carriage. It was Marie Antoinette, dressed in a simple dress and hat. The royal family was attempting to escape to Austria. There the queen's brother, the Austrian emperor, might be persuaded to invade France and restore the monarchy to its old powers. Their plans failed. They were discovered when they reached the town of Varennes by a man who recognized the king from his image on French money. The king and his family were brought back to Paris in humiliation. Soldiers of the National Guard lined the streets of Paris, their muskets reversed as if for a funeral. Huge crowds watched the passing carriage, but they were silent. Okay, so basically we're just finding out here that they did attempt to escape, but they were unsuccessful in that attempt. All had read the official notices that had been posted, warning the people, whoever applauds the king shall be flogged, whipped, whoever insults him shall be hanged. Now the king had lost not only the limited power he had as a constitutional monarch, but also the love and trust of his people. He and his family would now be prisoners in the palace of the Tuileries. A new legislative assembly. In September 1791, the National Assembly finished its job and stepped down. A new legislative assembly took its place, composed of younger men with different ideas. However, the old problems remained. Jobs and bread were still in short supply, and the people were getting angry once again. Okay, so we had the vocabulary word there in that paragraph, legislative assembly, and it was a group of representatives with the power to make laws for the country. So the old National Assembly has gone away, and now we have a new legislative assembly in its place. The Legislative Assembly held its meetings in the Royal Riding School in the gardens of the Tuileries, which now housed the king. In the center of the hall sat the president. The new deputies of the assembly were solid members of the middle class and included many lawyers, but they were deeply divided into 2 factions, which held conflicting ideas. Some deputies were conservatives, who wanted to keep the limited monarchy. Other deputies were radicals, who wanted to get rid of the king and set up a republic. Okay, so let's review the difference between monarchy and republic. Any part of a monarchy means you're going to have a king or a king and queen that are ruling the country in some way. The republic, the definition of republic, is a government in which people elect representatives to rule for them, so they would no longer have a king. The radicals sat to the left of the president, and the conservatives sat to his right. Soon people began to refer to deputies as left-wingers or right-wingers. Elsewhere in France, there were some people whose views were even more extreme than the views of the deputies in the Legislative Assembly. On the left, there were some extreme radicals who wanted to sweep away all of the old rules and traditions and establish complete equality and democracy. On the extreme right, there were conservatives who wanted to go back to the absolute monarchy. But this time, however, most conservatives had left the country. France at war. The Austrian Emperor, Leopold II, who was also Marie Antoinette's brother, supported the extreme right-wingers. He did not support the revolution in France. After all, it set a bad example. Other Europeans might start wanting liberty and equality too. And then what would happen to European monarchs like him? And revolution could spread to European colonies too. Then what would happen? Indeed, revolution did spread beyond Europe. On August 22nd, 1791, 50,000 enslaved workers rose up on a French colonial island in the Caribbean called Saint Dominique. With its sugar plantations, this island was the richest Caribbean colony. After the revolt, this island would be renamed Haiti and would become the first Black republic in the world. When Austria threatened to attack France, the radicals in the assembly responded with enthusiasm. They felt this would give France an opportunity to spread its revolutionary ideals: liberty, freedom of speech, religion, the press, and so on. Equality, all citizens equal under the law, no special privileges for any one group. Fraternity, the comradeship of all French citizens working together for the good of France. France must rise to the full height of her mission, shouted one deputy. Yes, yes, shouted the others, and then they declared war on Austria. The war went badly for France. I am not able to understand, raged Lafayette, how we could ever get into war without the slightest preparation. The poorly trained soldiers fled at the sight of the well-equipped, well-trained armies of the enemy. Their flight left the road to Paris open. Rumors spread wildly through Paris. The king and queen are traitors. They have betrayed us to the enemy. How else could the French army have been so easily beaten? Once again, the sans-culottes turned to violence. Early in the morning of August 10th, 1792, the king and queen, who had been awake all night, listened to the church bells ring an ominous alarm. They knew that something terrible was about to happen. The loyal Swiss guards stood by, ready to defend the Tuileries. Then news came. The sans-culottes had taken over the city government, and a mob was rapidly approaching the Tuileries. Okay, so remember, the sans-culottes were the working class, the third estate, and their ideas are good. They want things like liberty and equality. They just are going about them in a very harsh way. So they're a mob, they're rioting, they're very violent. When the mob broke through the heavy oak gates, the palace defenders were ready. They fired muskets and cannons, and the mob retreated. But then there was a new sound. Not a mob, but marching feet. It was the militia from the provinces, mainly from the southern province of Marseille. These were rough and ragged men who had marched all the way to Paris to join the fight against the Austrians. Along the way they sang a song, the Marseillaise, that later would become the French national anthem. The troops were intent on dethroning the king. Despite heroic efforts by palace guards, the militia and mob forced their way into the palace. Meanwhile, a deputy of the National Assembly was with the royal family, ready to take them to safety. "Look, sire," he cried, as he pointed out the window. "A whole people are advancing. If the palace must fall, let it fall, but let the crown be saved." The king and his family hurried through the back of the palace and made their way across the gardens to seek protection of the Legislative Assembly, which was meeting in the writing school. But the assembly could not protect them. Meanwhile, the mob burst into the palace and slaughtered 500 members of the Swiss Guards. Then they killed anyone else they could find in the palace, cooks, maids, and servants, and went from room to room, looting and destroying. More than 1,000 people perished. The violence marked the end of the monarchy. The king and his family were taken as prisoners to the Temple, a medieval fortress. The coachman drove slowly, so people in the streets could witness the royal family on its nightmare journey to prison. Okay, so again, The people that were in favor of the Republic did not have bad ideas. The ideas that they had for equal rights for all people were good ideas. It's just that they went about getting them in a very violent way. So the Tuileries was the palace that was in Paris, obviously not safe for the royal family at this time. In September, a new and far more radical legislative assembly, the National Convention, was elected. It would soon decide the fate of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. The death of the king. On September 22nd, 1792, the National Convention declared France a republic and announced the end of the monarchy. Now Louis was harmless and had no power. Stripped of his crown and title, he was to be known as Louis Capet. The revolutionaries were not sure what to do with him, though. They spent hours debating his fate. The king must be killed, declared the young, elegant, but cruel deputy, Antoine de Saint-Just. Royalty is an eternal crime. The king must not have a long trial. He must be killed. But what was his crime? Others asked. Should a man be killed just because he was born a king? Despite these objections, the king was put on trial. In the convention, one delegate argued against the trial. I am tired of my part of despotism, tormented by the tyranny I am forced to exercise. Okay, despotism, tyranny, rule by a leader who has total and often oppressive power. So it goes back to having complete and total control. But the trial went on, and Louis was found guilty of conspiracy against the nation. What would be his punishment? Imprisonment? Banishment? After 3 days of debate, the vote was taken, and the verdict was announced. The king must die. The most shocking vote in favor of the death penalty was cast by the former Duke of Orleans, a cousin of Louis, who had changed his name to Philippe Égalité, or Philip Equality is what it would translate to. Later, when the revolution swirled out of control, Philippe Égalité would himself be executed. On January 1st, 1793, Louis, the descendant of Bourbon kings who had ruled France for centuries, was driven in a carriage to the guillotine. And we know what the guillotine is. It's the machine designed to behead people. Weak during life, he approached his death with dignity and high courage. Louis calmly climbed the steps to the guillotine, his priest beside him. He placed his head beneath the heavy blade that hung high above him. He began to speak. I die innocent. But a roll of drums drowned out his words. The blade fell and the crowd cheered. Long live the Republic. Some formed a human chain that danced around the guillotine, singing the Marseillaise. The king was dead, and the queen would soon follow in his footsteps. The fate of the queen. On the morning of October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette dressed herself for the last time. She wore a white dress, stockings, and silk shoes. Guards escorted her from her dark prison cell and placed her in an open cart for the long ride to the guillotine. She too had been tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. The only reminder that she had been a queen was in her bearing. She held her head high, but gone was the sparkling, lovely Marie Antoinette. Here was a tired woman, dressed in plain clothing, more fit for a chambermaid. As she climbed the steps to the guillotine, some observers stated that she accidentally stepped on her executioner's foot and said, "Pardon me, sir, I meant not to do it." Those, it is claimed by some, were her last words. Okay, and we kind of knew that that would be their fate after what we had been reading in the Scarlet Pimpernel.